So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I wish I were in Israel instead of in my basement, but it's great to have so many people here, and including, I should note, my mother. So hi, Mom. And so let us begin. According to the Babylonian Talmud, the rabbinic sage Rabbah would begin each lesson by telling a joke. After his students laughed, he turned to the serious business of Torah learning. Inspired by Rabbah, I originally intended to begin my talk with a joke about rabbinic kosher laws. But I soon realized that this would not work, because each joke that I thought of required me to extensively explain its background. And nothing ruins a joke faster than having to explain it. As I have learned from extensive experience, I am no stand-up comedian. My jokes have footnotes, and footnotes are not funny. After this realization, I came to another conclusion. All of the jokes that I thought of centered around a tension. On the one hand, they acknowledge the myriad rules governing kosher law, kashrut in Hebrew. On the other hand, they acknowledge the role that human politics play in the arena of normative rabbinic law, in Hebrew halakha. This tension between religious law and human politics plays out in the kosher controversies that we will explore in my talk today. Given time constraints, I will only be able to cover a few of the many fascinating and heated kosher debates that reverberate for centuries, and even millennia. Before I begin, however, I must make a disclaimer. When I discuss these debates, I'm neither making sure that everyone, I'm saying that you neither have to follow these rules or that there's one correct interpretation of these rules or one incorrect interpretation of the category of kosher. Rather, my aim is simply to introduce a few intriguing examples of when tensions between religious law and human politics lead to kosher controversies. Soon, we learn about how cooking fowl in milk became prohibited, why some American Reform Jews refused to eat pork, but ate oysters, why balabustas took to the street of New York City in 1902 to riot over the price of kosher meat, and about the recent controversy over the kashrut of the Roman Jewish dish known as the Jewish artichoke. But first, we begin with the biblical scandal of baking cakes to the Queen of Heaven. Okay, oops, I'll go back one. Okay, so though the Hebrew Bible never uses the term kosher to refer to food, later rabbinic tradition builds a complex system of kosher food laws on what it interprets as a solid biblical foundation. In its elaboration, rabbinic literature contains many kosher scandals. In contrast, the Hebrew Bible has relatively few. Though God tells the Israelites what meat they can and cannot eat, there are almost no instances in which the Israelites are depicted as not complying with these rules. Sure, they might complain about the drudgery of eating manna while wandering in the desert, but aside from some Israelites eating idolatrous sacrificial food noted mainly in the book of Numbers, some faint echoes about some people eating pig in the prophetic book of Isaiah, or Daniel's concern about eating food prepared by a foreign king, kosher scandals are a conspicuous absence from biblical texts, with one exception, that is. Twice in the prophetic book of Jeremiah, a scandalous tradition is referenced. First, God commands Jeremiah, "And as for you, do not pray on behalf of this people. Do not lift up a cry or a prayer on their behalf, and do not entreat me, for I will not listen to you. Do you not see what they are doing in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem? The children gather wood, and the fathers kindle a fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the Queen of Heaven. And they pour out libations to the other gods who provoke me to anger." God instructs Jeremiah not to offer prayer on behalf of those who worship the Queen of Heaven. Clearly, this is a practice that greatly annoys God. Later in the book of Jeremiah, the people double down on this scandalous practice. In a longer passage, the participation of women in rituals is especially accented. For our present purposes, the most important claim is, "And when we burn incense to the Queen of Heaven and pour out libations to her, it is without our husband's consent. Is it without our husband's consent that we make for her cakes in her image and poured out libations to her?" Written in the voice of women who felt that things did not go well when the worship of Queen of Heaven previously had ceased, we learn that some women decided to defy their husbands and God and bake cakes in the image of the Queen of Heaven. In considering this a kosher scandal, I'm arguing for a very broad definition of the concept of kosher scandal. In my opinion, kosher scandals involve Jewish individuals or communities vigorously debating whether a given food or food practice is allowed or permitted, allowed or prohibited, acceptable or problematic. The issue can be culinary or commensal in nature. That is, it can center on what one eats or how one eats. In this case, the practice of baking a specific cake is deemed a forbidden practice. Why? Because it is part of a bundled set of ritual practices associated with worshiping a deity other than the Israelite God. If that is all that there was to this, then I would not have started my talk with this scandal. But the legacy of this text lives on in a surprising manner. But before telling the story, I should caution you that what I'm about to say cannot be unlearned. So if you do not want to know the scandalous history of Hamantaschen, then you might want to cover your eyes and ears right about now. Hamantaschen, the plural of Hamantash, refers to a filled pastry shaped in a triangle. Gil Marx, an Orthodox rabbi, chef, and Jewish food historian, noted that this cookie has medieval Teutonic origins, and that based on similarities between the German word for poppy seed version, Montasche, meaning poppy seed pocket, German Jews came to refer to this pastry as Hamantasch, meaning Haman's or Haman's pocket. This etymology makes sense. Haman is the villain in the book of Esther, the biblical book that forms the basis for the Jewish holiday of Purim. And the Hebrew name Haman, pronounced in some Yiddish dialects as Hamon, sounds a lot like Mon, German for poppy seeds. The biblical villain Haman is never specifically referred to as having pockets, nor is he described as wearing a hat, triangular or otherwise, which is another folk reason given for the shape of the cookie. And while he presumably had ears, despite the fact that modern Hebrew name for Hamantaschen is Oznei Haman, meaning Haman's ears, which also refers to another sweet treat. Here it is, a picture I took in Italy several years ago, with Purim, which is either of Spanish or Italian origin, another sweet treat. The book of Esther never mentions Haman's ears. While Marx's origin story for Hamantaschen is the standard account that appears in newspapers and magazine stories each year around the time of Purim, it ignores a much longer history in which triangular pastries are associated with the biblical heroine Esther. To learn this scandalous story, we need to return to the Queen of Heaven. Remember that baking cakes to the Queen of Heaven was a practice that both greatly angered God and was primarily performed by women. Ancient rituals performed by women angered God, ancient rituals performed by women are often interpreted as fertility rites. While there is good reason to not reduce every practice performed by ancient women to a single essentialist and gendered model, in this case there's strong evidence in support of understanding baking cakes to the Queen of Heaven as a fertility ritual. Here's why. First, the Queen of Heaven is almost certainly the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar, who's referred to by the same title in Akkadian texts. Second, once we accept that Ishtar is the Queen of Heaven, we must consider the fact that Ishtar is associated with the fertility cult, in which women played a central role. Third, as part of devotion to Ishtar, there was a common practice of baking cakes to her. Fourth, in a related point, the word used for cakes in the two passages in Jeremiah, the Hebrew kavanim, appears nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible. It is only used to refer to baking goods for the Queen of Heaven. Kavanim is a loan word from the Akkadian kamanu, which is a sacrificial cake sweetened with honey and figs, and we have several attestations of kamanu being offered to Ishtar. So the Queen of Heaven is Ishtar. But what does that have to do with Hamantaschen? First, the name Esther likely derives from the Akkadian Ishtar. Thus, the heroine of Purim has Ishtar for a name. Second, there's a common ancient practice of baking and ingesting sweet cakes as part of a fertility ritual. These cakes are usually triangular in shape, so as to represent female external genitalia. For example, the ancient Greek Thesmophoria festival involved offering such cakes to the goddesses Demeter and Persephone. The basic concept is that by creating and then ingesting sweet cakes shaped like the pubic triangle, the consumer embodies fertility and thus is able to conceive. So thus, long before medieval German Jews encountered the Montasche, there was a history of associating Esther with the consumption of a triangular pastry. Now, in connecting German triangular pastry with Purim, medieval Jews likely, and I would argue almost certainly, were not aware of the scandalous past embodied in their poppy seed pocket. They certainly did not imagine their tasty treat as connected to a biblical practice that God decries. While for Jeremiah, it was a kosher controversy, for medieval German Jews, it was merely a cookie. While the scandalous ancient past of Purim cookies might not have been known to medieval Jews, our next kosher controversy is one that its controversial nature was already known at that time. So we now turn to the early rabbinic debates about whether fowl may be cooked with milk, and in a section that I entitle, There's No Communication Like Excommunication. Our story begins in the Hebrew Bible, where on 3 separate occasions, twice in Exodus and once in Deuteronomy, the same prohibition appears verbatim. Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. This prohibition and the pig taboo, which we will discuss later, are the 2 most well-known biblical kosher laws. Despite this notoriety, the seemingly straightforward rule is anything but. Does it refer only to cooking meat in the milk of its actual mother? Only to a kid, that is to a baby goat, and not to a baby cow? To all meat cooking in all milk? The rabbis debate these and many other points. Before I get to the rabbinic debate, it is important to note that the rabbinic reading does not represent the only way that ancient Jews interpreted this passage. For example, the Jewish philosopher Philo, who died at the midpoint of the 1st century CE, argues that this law is to be read literally as a lesson about cruelty. After all, it is easy to find milk that does not come from the actual mother of that animal. So according to Philo, if one cooked meat from a baby animal in milk that comes from not from its mother, but from any other mother, then that would not violate this biblical taboo, and for Philo would therefore be kosher. While Philo reads the law as specific, that is, as referring only to its mother's milk, the rabbis read the law as general, that is, referring to all meat cooked in all milk. For them, it is not a law about cruelty to animals. It is simply a divine commandment. In fact, like all kosher laws, this prohibition is classified by the rabbis as belonging to the legal category of chukim, which are commandments not justified on the basis of logic, that must nevertheless be followed. In order to follow a commandment, however, it must be understood. Therefore, they spell out the limits of this law. For example, we're told that it does not apply to fish and locusts. Thus, a locust and cheese sandwich is totally kosher. Before we turn to the controversial question of whether fowl should be considered meat for the purposes of this law, another important observation must be made. What we learn from reading Philo is that at least some, and likely most, Torah-observant Jews in antiquity believed that by not cooking meat in the actual milk produced by its literal mother, they were adhering to divine commandments. Then the rabbis came along and radically reinterpret this law. As David Kramer has persuasively argued, this rabbinic interpretation separates rabbinic from non-rabbinic Jews. Both believe that they were following God's commandments. However, if meat was cooked in milk, then rabbinic Jews could no longer eat what non-rabbinic Jews themselves to be considered biblically kosher. This is a radical rupture in tradition, which the rabbis portray as a seamless continuity. Their very innovation was itself a kosher controversy. Yet the rabbis portray this novelty as neither novel nor worthy of comment. Instead, they probe the limits of the law. One of the most vexing concerns for them is whether fowl should be included in this prohibition. If fowl is classified as meat, then it should not be cooked in milk. But fowl produce no milk, so this claim defies logic. And even though food laws are classified in a rabbinic legal category that is not based on logic, right, chukim, this logical contradiction bothered some ancient rabbis. And not just any old ancient rabbis. In the Mishnah, 2 major rabbinic figures voiced concern about the logic of including fowl in this prohibition. The famous Rabbi Akiva declares, fowl are not prohibited by the Torah. Einam min Torah, very clear. And more importantly, for reasons we shall soon learn, Rabbi Yossi the Galilean asserts that Scripture says in its mother's milk in order to exclude fowl, which has no mother's milk. Clearly, at least some venerable ancient rabbis believed that it was kosher to eat either a locust and cheese sandwich or a chicken and cheese sandwich. This interpretive debate turns into a kosher controversy in the Babylonian Talmud. There we learn the following encounter. Levi visited the house of Joseph the Fowler. They served him a peacock's head cooked in milk. He did not say anything to them. When he came before Rabbi Judah Anasi, and told him what happened, Rabbi said to him, "Why did you not excommunicate him?" Levi said to Rabbi, "It was the locale of Rabbi Judah ben Betera, and I thought perhaps he expounded for them in accordance with Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, who said, in order to exclude fowl, which has no mother's milk." Levi is faced with a common commensal dilemma: how to act when someone serves you food that you consider to transgress your religious, cultural, or ethical values. In this case, Levi clearly believes that fowl and milk should not be cooked together, but when he visits the house of his friend Joseph the Fowler, whose occupation, by the way, is not coincidental, he is served a peacock and milk dish. He says nothing, and some manuscripts state that he abstains from eating. Later, Levi relates the curious incident of the peacock and the milk to Rabbi. Rabbi shares Levi's view that fowl and milk may not be cooked together, so he immediately inquires why Levi did not excommunicate every person at that table. If you truly wish to communicate your displeasure over this practice, Rabbi argues, then you should excommunicate them. I really wanted to, Levi explains, but I was in another rabbi's territory, and one cannot invoke Levi's law while standing on Rabbi Judah ben Betera's turf. Not only that, but there is an authoritative position in the Mishnah that justifies this very practice. Namely Rabbi Yossi the Galilean's unambiguous statements. So Levi asks, how could I excommunicate them? But notice that this text presents both Levi's and Rabbi's views as normative. Joseph the Fowler's practice is seen as deviating from the norm. But is it really? There is established authoritative support for his peacock and milk dish. What we glean from this kosher controversy, then, is the beginning of a strong shift in rabbinic texts away from allowing the preparation of fowl and milk. Eventually, this becomes the dominant rabbinic view. However, even in asserting this practice as normative, rabbinic authorities often acknowledge that a controversy remains hidden below the surface. For example, the famous medieval authority Maimonides states, "Fowl cooked with milk of a domesticated animal is not forbidden for consumption by the Torah. Therefore, it is permitted to cook it together and is permitted to derive benefit from it. But it is forbidden for consumption by rabbinic law, in order that people do not get carried away and come to violate the biblical prohibition against milk and meat, and eat the meat of a pure domesticated animal cooked in the milk of a pure domesticated animal. For the literal meaning of Scripture refers only to a kid cooked in the milk of its actual mother. Therefore, they forbade all meat with milk." Maimonides freely admits that fowl is not biblical meat, but rather it is rabbinic meat. While he ignores the tradition of Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, among others, that supports the continuation of the biblical fowl is not meat policy, Maimonides explicitly acknowledges that in this case, rabbinic law functions much like the famous Jewish joke, where dancing is forbidden, but certain salacious practices are only forbidden, because it might lead to dancing. Fowl is the gateway meat. Like dancing, cooking fowl and milk might lead people to get carried away and thus to violating the biblical prohibition against meat and milk. In the midst of our conversation about fowl and milk, I noted that do not cook a kid in its mother's milk is one of the two most well-known kosher biblical laws. The other famous food taboo is the biblical prohibition against cooking pork, or consuming pork and cooking it. We turn our attention now to a kosher controversy involving the forbidden meat in a section that I entitle, No Pork, Yes Oyster. Our story begins in the biblical book of Leviticus. Leviticus 11 addresses the dietary laws concerning 5 categories of non-human animals. Within the first 4 categories, subsets of animals are either permitted or tabooed. The 5th category, small land animals, is completely prohibited. In discussing the first category of animals, quadrupeds, a criterion for ingestion is provided. Only those quadrupeds that have both split hoofs and chew the cud can be eaten. Leviticus 11:4-7 then enumerates 4 quadrupeds that it deems to have one, but not both of the criteria. The camel, the rock badger, and the hare chew the cud but do not split hooves. As an aside, though, modern biology has taught us that neither the rock badger nor the hare actually chew the cud, but it seems that the constant movement of their jaws led observers to presume that they did. And the pig has split hooves, but does not chew the cud. Leviticus neither offers a justification for this taboo, nor singles out the pig. From this seemingly humble origin, the culinary regulation concerning the pig in Leviticus 11:7 takes on a life of its own, and eventually is viewed as perhaps the most well-known biblical food taboo. Taboo, right? Food or otherwise. As I'm currently writing a book on the history of Jews and the pig, I could easily have made pork the centerpiece of this entire talk, as there are myriad kosher controversies that involve pork. But from among those several swine scandals, I've selected one particular controversy, the notorious Treyfa banquet. On July 11th, 1883, the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, hosted a banquet to celebrate the ordination of the American College's first class of American Reform rabbis. Later greatly mythologized and famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, known as the Treyfa or non-kosher banquet, the menu on this gourmet feast included 4 biblically forbidden foods: clams, crabs, shrimp, and frogs. It also violated other rabbinic dietary regulations by serving non-kosher meat and mixing milk and meat. Over the series of elaborate courses, each accompanied with its own wine or spirit, in accordance with notions of haute cuisine or French-inspired high cuisine that then and still to this day are popular among Americans as signifying high culinary class conventions. The diners who partook of this feast and those who, according to reports, stormed out when they saw the menu, which appears on your screen, they each made a statement about Reform Judaism's stance on Jewish dietary laws and, by extension, on Reform theology in general. The intra- and interdenominational consternation inspired in part by the Treyfa banquet eventually contributed to the bifurcation of American Judaism, still evidenced today. Lost in the haze of those who did and did not eat the clams, crabs, shrimp, and frogs was the fact that this transgressive meal did not transgress one particular biblical food taboo. Pork never appeared on the menu. Since this banquet was served in Cincinnati, a city in Ohio that at the time was nicknamed Porkopolis, this absence is worthy of note. Though 2 years later, in 1885, the Reform movement would adopt the Pittsburgh Platform that rejected all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws that regulate diet. In general, the Reform Judaism initially did not violate this particular dietary prohibition. In fact, initial discussions about Reform Judaism's stance on non-kosher foods in America centered around 2 foods, pork and oysters, with the general opinion that pork was prohibited, but oysters were permitted. As a sea creature with neither fins nor scales, oysters fail the biblical kosher test. They were, however, as Mark Kurlansky's popular book, The Big Oyster, History on the Half Shell, has demonstrated, tasty, affordable, popular, readily available in America, considered healthy, and as an added bonus, an aphrodisiac. Now, I'm going to read you 2 of my favorite quotes that come up in this talk. So these factors led Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, the founder of Hebrew Union College, to refer to oysters as quote-unquote ocean vegetables. Further, he argued that, quote, there can be no doubt that the oyster shell is the same to all intents and purposes as the scales to the clean fish, protecting against certain gases in the water, end quote. Thus, he permitted their ingestion. No such reinterpretation occurred for pork. Reform rabbi and American Jewish historian Lance Sussman aptly summarized this widespread opinion as indicative of a, quote, no pork, yes oyster viewpoint, end quote. The embrace of oyster was on display 3 months later after the Treyfa banquet, when 2 members of Hebrew Union College's first ordination class joined together to host a wedding party for themselves and their wives. Summarizing the menu, Sussman noted that a no-pork dinner was served, including fried and scalloped oysters, lobster salad, and cold buffalo tongue, to mention but a few of the many courses provided. For a variety of reasons, Reform Judaism amended its official stance 2 years later at the convention that ultimately produced the Pittsburgh Platform. By rejecting all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws that regulate diet, Reform Judaism had now officially promulgated a yes pork and yes oyster policy. But their delay suggests the tension between the legacy of more than 2 million millennia of historical baggage embodied in the pig, and their interpretation of Judaism in the post-Enlightenment world of modern America. They were willing to serve various biblically non-kosher foods at their ordination ceremony and at other public events. But it took further deliberation before they crossed the line represented by the pig. In a motif that appears numerous times over more than 2,000 years, for a Jew to eat pig embodies the ultimate rejection of Jewish belief and practice. So it was not without serious deliberation that Reform Judaism placed pork on their plate, alongside their oysters. For them, however, this represented not a complete rejection of Jewish belief and practice, but rather a rejection of a particular model of Jewish belief and practice. In sum, by saying yes to pork, they were not saying no to Judaism, they were saying no to one manifestation of Judaism and yes to another manifestation. Our next kosher controversy occurs about 2 decades later. On May 15th, 1902, Jewish women took to the streets of New York City. Peaceful protests soon gave way to violence. Fists and bricks were thrown. Windows and bones were broken. One police officer was slapped across the face with a piece of liver. The cause of this beef? The rising cost of kosher meat. Before we get into the occasionally humorous details of the riot that ensued, we need to understand how this kerfuffle was both part of a general experience of the economics of systems of food production and distribution in the United States of America, and particular to the Jewish experience in America and beyond. Regarding the former, there's a rich literature on how America built a food system designed to focus on high quantity and low price. The American mythos imagined and thus crafted the country as, in the famous Yiddish phrase, a goldene Medina, a golden land. Therefore, food systems developed to make available large quantities of meat that everyone, rich and poor, felt entitled to eat regularly. As we might guess, the Golden Land's food system allowed certain businesses to grow and industries to work together, legally and or illegally, and sometimes both, to ensure the accumulation of much gold for their corporate owners and shareholders, though not necessarily for their employees and their customers. Regarding the latter, while Jews ate meat more regularly in America than they had in Europe, many, although by no means all, refused to eat meat that was not kosher. Despite America's reputation back in the old country as a Treyfa Medina, as a non-kosher land, many Jews who came to America did not renounce religious practices, especially in regard to diet. However, the process of ensuring that animals were slaughtered and butchered according to rabbinic kosher regulations added cost to the final product. The extra cost was the subject of much angst. In addition to the financial burden, there was also the fraught historical baggage of the korobka, a tax on kosher meat that dates to the 17th century in some Jewish communities in Europe. For poor immigrant Jews who wished to eat only kosher meat, the rising cost of kosher meat hit them especially hard. Even if a Jew were willing to purchase non-kosher meat, the cost of all meat was rising. Something was not kosher with the economics of the American meat industry. We now know that costs rose because of price fixing by the beef trust. But for the man, or more accurately, as we shall see, the woman on the street, it seemed as if the butchers were to blame for the sudden rise in the price of kosher meat, from 12 cents to 18 cents a pound. Butchers had to pay more for meat, and they passed that additional cost on to their customers. The butchers were the face of the problem, rather than the faceless corporations. And as the face of the problem, they took it on the chin. Our story begins as both the price of meat and the anger over that additional cost rise. To express their concern, many Jews in the Lower East Side of Manhattan planned a boycott of kosher meat. On May 11th, 1902, A meeting to discuss communal action drew a crowd of 1,500 people. As a result of this meeting, according to one local newspaper, kosher meat, quote, is likely to be as scarce around the Jewish neighborhood of Essex Street as a ham sandwich, end quote. With anger fermenting, a grassroots movement arose spontaneously. This was before Twitter, so it was well done to get this moving so quickly. And the unexpected leaders of this movement were the balabustas, Yiddish for Jewish women homemakers. While a kosher meat boycott had begun, many balabustas were not satisfied with its progress. As the ones most often going to butcher shops to shop and buy meat, they felt the direct economic impact of meat's rising price on their wallet, especially with most household budgets already stretched perilously thin. Sarah Edelson, Paulina Wax-Finkel, and Fanny Levy organized a meeting of Jewish women on May 14, 1902. Though their meeting's venue could hold only 500 people, an overflow crowd of women showed up. Unlike the meeting on May 11th, this meeting was organized by and predominantly attended by women. These balabustas weren't satisfied with the previous day's actions. In the words of Fanny Levy, quote, "This is their strike? Let the women make a strike. Then there will be a strike," end quote. And with that, the fuse was lit. Early the next morning on May 15th, women took to the streets and quickly, things escalated from a boycott to a riot. When one woman, in violation of the boycott, bought a piece of meat from a kosher butcher on Cherry Street, balabustas confiscated her meat and then stormed the butcher shop to do the same with his entire stock. Arriving on the scene, police arrested the rioting women. The crowd threw stolen meat at them. The police responded with violence, indiscriminately beating the protesters with clubs. Escalation continued as police violence was met with violence by women and men on the street. Things were getting out of hand. Though the day was still young, arrests were piling up. When the Essex Market Police Court opened at 9 a.m., there were already 30 disorderly conduct cases on City Magistrate Robert C. Cornell's docket, and dozens more followed as the day went on. Cornell displayed neither sympathy nor empathy for these women. He also made sexist comments questioning the women's ability to grasp the economic factors behind the meat business. One exchange is telling. After Cornell rebuked Rebecca Ablowitz for rioting, she denied the charge and then asserted, quote, "But if we cry at home, nobody will see us. We have to help ourselves," end quote. The gender of the rioters is a subject of much discussion throughout the event. Balabusta rioters felt ignored and disrespected in the first place, hence Ablowitz's comment about crying at home. When police responded with violence, many were aghast more at the fact that women were attacked by the police than the fact that police were violent in general. No matter what side they came down on, journalists, judges, participants in the event, and mere observers made comments based on their gendered assumptions about the fact that this kosher meat riot was a woman's movement. We cannot ignore the fact that the role that gender played in both the events and in their subsequent interpretations. Returning to Cornell's courtroom, many women who appeared before the magistrate were ordered to pay fines for their actions on May 15th. Remember that those women were protesting the high cost of meat because they were poor. Therefore, most did not have the money to pay their fines. Quickly, the nascent movement raised funds to help these balabustas settle their debt. The violence continued into the night, and then after a short respite began the next morning. May 16th was a Friday. On sundown Friday night, the Jewish Sabbath Shabbat begins. On a normal Friday, the day is spent preparing food, in which meat is often prominent, for the day of rest. But this was no normal Friday. Butchers who opened their shops were terrorized. Meat was stolen. Sometimes kerosene was poured on confiscated meat, thus rendering the meat inedible. Many protesters were arrested, some of whom never made it to court because other protesters assaulted the police, thus allowing the arrested to escape. Minnie Ostlander, this is one of my favorite stories of this, stole a chicken that Mrs. Schwartz purchased for the Sabbath and then was arrested while screaming and displaying the chicken prominently. She was holding the chicken above her head and running down the street screaming. Magistrate Cornell fined Ostlander $10, which was a lot of money back then. By the end of the day, Cornell had 70 women out of 90 total people fined. Cornell had fined 70 women out of total 90 fined. So shortly after 7 p.m., the Sabbath began, and finally, the streets were quiet. While Saturday was a day of rest, the day was not without unrest. Across the Lower East Side, women went to the male-controlled and gender-segregated space of the synagogue and asked to address the whole congregation regarding the meat boycott. These requests were met with mixed results. Some synagogues welcomed the message. At least 2 called the police. At sundown Saturday night, rioters returned to action after their day of rest. Chickens were tossed in gutters. Stones were thrown at police. One butcher threatened a crowd with a meat cleaver and an axe. The riot also spread beyond the Lower East Side of Manhattan, with violence in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Harlem, and soon flared up outside of New York in Boston and Newark. The protest movement was aided by the panopticon of neighborhood women. In a foundational study of the kosher meat riots, historian Paula Hyman notes, quote, "The constant presence in the neighborhood of the housewife leaders of the boycotts made it difficult for individuals to evade their surveillance. The neighborhood, a form of female network, thus provided the locus of community for the boycott," end quote. That's how they did it without Twitter. While balabustas were out front in the first few days, it was not long before men elbowed their way in to take control of the movement. On Sunday, May 18th, an organization was voted into existence, the Ladies Anti-Beef Trust Association. That meant that there were committees and subcommittees charged with various related tasks. For example, circulars bearing a skull and crossbones and the slogan, "Eat no meat while the beef trust is taking meat from the bones of your women and children," were distributed throughout the Jewish quarters of the city. However, the establishment of the new organization, despite its title, right, of the Ladies Beef Trust Association, marked the end of a completely female-led movement. It also brought the kosher meat protest into more mainstream movements, such as the broader movements for workers' rights. As the committees did their work, violence did not necessarily stop. For example, on May 22nd, a Norfolk Street butcher shop made the mistake of trying to open. 700 protesters showed up, not all of whom were peaceful. A fish peddler who had set up too close to the action found his wagon knocked over and looted a fish. Rioters then threw those fish at police. While protesters and violence continued on and off for the next 3 weeks, behind-the-scenes negotiations eventually led to the lowering of the cost of kosher meat to 14 cents a pound, still up from 12. Though still 2 pounds more than when the kerfuffle began, apparently it was enough to quell the community's anger. I must say apparently, because there is little historical documentation of the end of the kosher meat riots. While the colorful stories of bricks and fish and liver flying through the air made headlines 3 weeks earlier, the conclusion was met with relative quiet. As Scott Seligman, who recently wrote an entire book on these riots, aptly summarizes, quote, "If the movement had begun in mid-May with a bang, it ended in mid-June with a whimper, decided whimper," end quote. Further compounding our analysis is the fact that its leaders faded into obscurity with the conclusion of the boycott. I could name these women's names from there, but then the records of them after are almost none. I find it deeply unsatisfying to imagine the balabustas, who caused so much trouble agitating to better their economic conditions, quietly returning to their home kitchens and disappearing into the shadows of history. Hopefully, retelling these events bring their stories back to life. Once more, their voices can rise, perhaps with a stolen chicken held high above their head, demanding for fair prices for kosher food. We step away from the riotous streets of Manhattan and stroll over to the ancient cobblestones of Rome. Here we encounter another kosher controversy, this time related to a vegetable, the artichoke. To understand why this vegetable became scandalous, we must turn our attention now to a section that I entitle The Artichoke War. On May 1st, 2018, the New York Times published a story titled, "Is This Artichoke Kosher? Rome Defends a Classic Dish." To briefly summarize the story, Israel's chief rabbinate had just declared the famous Roman Jewish dish, known as the Jewish artichoke, to be treif. Known in Italian as carciofi alla Judea, the Jewish artichoke is a delicious dish prepared by taking a whole artichoke, peeling the outside layer, frying the artichoke whole, and then just before serving, refrying the artichoke. The process produces a crisp outside layer and a soft inner core. Note the crispy appearance of the carciofo, the artichoke, that appears on this slide. I took this picture in Rome, later in the same month that the story appeared. By showing you this photo, I am doing two things. First, I am tipping my hat and telling you that I personally consider carciofi alla Judea to be kosher and not treif. And second, now my entire family trip to Rome is tax deductible. The artichoke is neither an animal nor an animal product. So this ruling by Israel's chief rabbinate might seem surprising. Why then was the Jewish artichoke declared not kosher? In an interview with the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, the head of the Israeli chief rabbinate's import division stated, "The heart of the artichoke is full of worms. There is no way you can clean it. It cannot be kosher," he explained, adding, "This is not our policy. This is Jewish religious law." The Israeli chief rabbinate claimed that since carciofi alla Judea are fried whole, then there's no way to clean all of the worms out of the artichoke's core. Therefore, there's a high likelihood that eating a Jewish artichoke necessarily involves also eating non-kosher worms. A completely dewormed artichoke would be kosher, but given that this particular preparation prevents a thorough deworming, the Israeli chief rabbinate pronounced it treif. And thus began what one daily newspaper in Rome, Il Messaggero, termed La Guerra del Carciofo, or Italian for the Artichoke War. Several legal or halakhic concerns lay at the heart of the Artichoke War. First, there's a general rabbinic policy that defers to the ruling of the local authority. And Rabbi Riccardo Di Segni, the chief rabbi of Rome, once declared, "Noi non siamo solo il popolo della Shoah, siamo anche il popolo del carciofo," meaning we are not only the people of the Shoah, the Holocaust, we are also the people of the artichoke. Therefore, there is a strong legal reason to follow his ruling, at least when on his rabbinic turf. Remember the earlier case of Levi in Rabbi Judah ben Beter's territory. This then would be a literal example of the principle that when in Rome, do as the Romans do. In this case, by eating as the Romans do. Second, there's a long history of rabbinic acceptance of the artichoke. Derived from Greek and or Latin, the Hebrew word for artichoke, kinnaras, and its variant terms appear in legal texts starting in the Mishnah, where its status as a kosher vegetable is presumed. It asks other related questions about how it can be prepared at different times, for example, but never about whether it's kosher or not, because it presumes it is. Third, there's a long tradition of embracing the artichoke by Jews in general, and Italian Jews in particular. In early modern Italy, according to Gil Marx, non-Jewish Italians at first spoke disparagingly of the artichoke, referring to it as the Jewish vegetable. Eventually, its regard spread from the Italian ghettos, particularly amongst the Medicis of Florence. In fact, Pope Gregory XVI and Camillo Abina, who's the chief rabbi of Rome, they formed a friendship in the 1800s, said to have been fed by their common passion for carciofi alla Judea. And yet, while carciofi alla Judea dates back as a dish at least to the 16th century, controversy about the dish only dates to 2018. Set against these concerns, we must ask, if there is at least a 2,000-year history of accepting the artichoke as kosher, why then does the Jewish artichoke become scandalous in 2018? To answer this question, first we need to learn why tap water was pronounced non-kosher in 2004. The story of tap water controversy is remarkably similar to the story of the Jewish artichoke scandal. In both cases, packaged vegetables shipped from one country to another were inspected and found to contain very tiny non-kosher creatures. While Italian artichokes were found to contain worms while examined in Israel, in the case of tap water controversy, an Israeli vegetable company named Bodek Foods promised, as their Hebrew name Bodek, meaning inspected, implies, that their vegetables products were already inspected and certified kosher and, importantly, insect-free. The scandal arose when Bodek's vegetables were opened in New York City and found to contain copepods, which are very tiny crustaceans, which are not kosher. Immediately an investigation occurred and the culprit was discovered. The packaged vegetables were insect-free. However, when the packages were opened and rinsed with New York City tap water, the copepods appear. Bodek had done its job. The vegetables were kosher, but New York City's tap water was not. The title of the New York Times story on the scandal summarized the controversy well. And this picture is from that story. There's something in the water, and it may not be strictly kosher. But are eating such insects and worms really not kosher? If you look at every rabbinic conversation on the topic written before I was born, the answer would be clear. Such creatures do not affect the kosher status of a food. For example, here's what Maimonides had to say on the issue. It's worth looking at this long text. Those species of insects or worms that, according to the scientific models prevalent in Maimonides' day, are created in fruit and other foods. If they have never separated from the fruit or food, it is permissible to eat the fruit and the worm that is in it. And so too, water that is in vessels which are teeming with worms or insects. Behold, it is permissible to drink these creepy crawlies with the water. Aquatic creepy crawlies that, according to scientific models prevalent in his day, are created in wells, ditches, and caves. Since the water is not flowing and they are stagnant, behold, they are like the water that is in the vessel and are permitted to drink the water, including whatever organisms contained in it. And one may bend and drink from this water, and they need not refrain themselves from doing so, even though they swallow in the moment of drinking some of the small creepy crawlies contained therein. Maimonides clearly had no qualms eating at least some worms in his fruit. And when Maimonides looked at his water, he saw bugs and worms that, while not kosher if removed from their aquatic context, were perfectly permissible if consumed together with the water. Maimonides' views make sense of this reality where it was impossible to completely remove such creatures from his food system. And I should add that even in our modern, technologically advanced food system, there are detailed government regulations articulating the precise amount of creepy crawlies as well as animal waste products allowable in our food. Maimonides' view reflects general rabbinic opinion, both before and after him, until the 1980s, when a new stringent position began to appear. Tellingly, the stringent position long postdates the invention of the microscope by Anton van Leeuwenhoek in the 17th century. After learning of the microscope, rabbinic authorities consistently ruled in a manner similar to Maimonides. For them, halakha was macroscopic, not microscopic. And there was already a rich history of how rabbinic law deal with those insects and worms that one could see with the unaided human eye. A ruling by Rav Moshe Feinstein, one of the most authoritative Orthodox decisors in the second half of the 20th century, summarizes the pre-1980s mindset. All of the kosher generations, the great scholars and the righteous ones and the pious ones, never used a microscope, and it is clear that they upheld all of the laws of the Torah and failed in nothing, even unwittingly. In a book chapter devoted to explaining the tap water controversy, David Kramer argues that the new stringent position on bugs and worms is part of a larger pattern of stringent Orthodox rulings that appeared in the 1980s. A variety of foods and practices that were once unproblematic or vaguely of concern now were elevated to the levels of scandals. Kramer contextualizes this pattern against the backdrop of major debates in the Jewish community. In the 1980s, most notably, the Who is a Jew debate. From Reform Judaism's decision to accept patrilineal descent as well as matrilineal descent, concerns over rules in the conservative movement, to fears about intermarriage, to heated debates about conversion, the 1980s marked a time when the who, what, when, and whys of Jewish identity were being contested in numerous ways. And at that time, new kosher laws appeared to further mark some practices and the people who participated in them as either kosher or treif. This movement grew from a small wave lapping the shore to an enormous tidal wave, crashing down and eroding the beach. Thus, when in 2018 the Israeli chief rabbinate declared that katrofi ala Judea are not kosher, it is not an isolated ruling, but rather it's part of a larger process in which new kosher regulations are, for theological and political purposes, asserted as traditional halakha. Despite his claim that this is not our policy, this is Jewish religious law, it is actually both. It is Jewish law for some, though not all, modern Jewish communities, and it is their policy because of the identity politics embodied in bugs and worms, and how they're further embodied in the Israeli rabbinate's chief kosher policies. So while the Israeli chief rabbinate is claiming that we are the people that do not eat worms, there's a much longer Jewish history that supports Rabbi Ricardo Dissenyi's assertion that we are also the people of the artichoke. In this talk, I focused on 5 kosher controversies, but these are just the tip of the iceberg. Jewish history is replete with moments where tensions between religious law and human politics boiled over into kosher controversies and scandals. And as we have seen in the controversies that I've discussed, these scandals point towards larger issues concerning Jews' interactions with each other and with their surrounding cultures. To further accent this point, I briefly note two other recent kosher scandals, controversies, which highlight some issues that continue to be of concern today. In 1986, the infamous Vinegar Scandal occurred, in which a French company that produced kosher vinegar was found to have changed their ingredients without telling the kosher certification agency. For technical reasons, their new ingredients raised concerns about the kosher status of a product that had been labeled and sold as kosher vinegar. This rose to the level of scandal because this vinegar was used as an ingredient in hundreds of kosher certified products, including mayonnaise, ketchup, and salad dressing. The scandal brought the full impact of the industrial food kosher food system to public attention, despite the fact that the modern kosher certification agency owes its genesis to the industrial food system. In 1923, Heinz Baked Beans wanted to get its vegetarian baked beans certified kosher and hence became the first food certified by the Orthodox Union, now the world's largest kosher certification agency, known for its widely used OU symbol. The vinegar scandal therefore highlights the extent to which modern kosher certification is an integral part of the modern industrial food system, ruled by global conglomerates. It is for this reason that the country that produces the largest amount of kosher food today is neither Israel nor the United States, but China. Finally, perhaps most well known is the Postville Controversy. In 2004, news reports surfaced that something was not kosher at the massive agri-processors kosher slaughter facility in Postville, Iowa. The story made splashy headlines for several reasons. First, there was the fact that the largest kosher meatpacking plant in the United States was located in the Midwestern state of Iowa, which I live in Wisconsin, happens to be my neighbor. Second, there was the stark contrast between the plant's Lubavitch Hasidic management and the white Protestants surrounding the culture and the largely Hispanic immigrant employees. Third, there were allegations by the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, or PETA, of animal cruelty. These allegations were supported by graphic videos, which are still available online for those who want to look at them. Fourth, there followed a series of legal battles in which various violations against environmental, labor, regulatory, employment, financial, and other United States laws were alleged. Fifth, there were concerns about the violation of rabbinic slaughter law. Sixth, there were debates about the extent that both anti-Semitism and internal Jewish scorn for the other played in this controversy. While there's much that I could discuss regarding the scandal, the point that I wish to highlight is that this controversy raised in public consciousness the fact that kosher animal slaughter does not equate with what secular modern standards might consider humane animal slaughter. Kosher certification for animal slaughter concerns a variety of technical details, but compassionate treatment for the animals in slaughter is not actually part of the kosher system, and there are different definitions of what one would consider humane, and these all play out in the politics of this. This scandal, therefore, highlights the tension between perception and reality, and navigating the impact of this realization remains perhaps the most hot-button topic in contemporary conversations about kosher laws. In the two scandals that I've just noted, a theme persists, namely that the kosher laws interacting with modern food systems and modern food production systems in business. Today, kashrut is a multi-billion-dollar business in which, according to one recent survey, only 1/12 of the consumers of kosher foods are observant Jews. I mention that these facts neither to denigrate the modern kosher system, nor to take a particular stance on any particular issue, but rather to highlight the fact that as a modern, industrial, and financial system, kosher laws and the kosher controversies that they generate today will necessarily be affected by these larger global and corporate systems. Think about 1902, the kosher meat riots, and the meat, the ways that the meat industry was working together, and how that then caused this cascading effect. And that wasn't even particular to kosher meat, but it had some particular elements of it. So there's a rich history of claiming that something is not kosher. But what exactly it is that is not kosher and why it is not kosher is an ever-changing and fascinating story. And with that, I say thank you, and we can transition to questions.
Thank you very much, Jordan, for a very interesting and controversial lecture about controversial issues as well. And yes, we do have a few questions. I will read them to you. So actually, there were two questions from Ira Sharp and Marisia Shopik about impossible pork issue. I mean, what is your take on that? And please comment on the recent ruling against impossible pork.
Okay, great. Yeah, I almost wrote that as the conclusion, but decided not to. So it's interesting. So for those who don't know, there's a company, Impossible Meat, that makes fake meat product, and it's quite good. In my house, we regularly make Impossible Meat burgers, and they're loved by all. And they're certified kosher, and there's no meat product in them. So you can make a cheeseburger, right? And have that and not violate rabbinic law, and it's certified kosher by the OU. They recently created a product, Impossible Pork. And the OU, which has certified other fake meat products, including that, but particularly has certified other fake pork products, Bacos, fake bacon, made a decision not to certify Impossible Pork. Their argumentation was rather interesting because they very much clearly came out and stated it was because it was so close to pork, and there was a discomfort in doing that. Now I'm of two minds. On the one hand, as I said, I'm writing a book right now about the long history of Jews and the pig, and there's a long history of pig being singled out as particularly the ultimate example of Treyfa, and so pig being treated differently than everything else. On the other hand, there's a long history, and you just have to Google this. Many people have been discussing this, of viewing this as there are discussions in the Talmud of there being things that taste like pork, and saying, well, God prohibited pork, but allowed this particular fish that tastes a little bit like pork. So one could find, what I would say is, you can find ample historical reason to support OU's decision to treat this as particularly different, even though it is technically kosher from the ingredient perspective, but saying there's some other cultural level on it. And you can find ample reason to say that's ridiculous. Is it kosher or not? It's kosher, so it should be certified. So and then people try and bring in a variety of other arguments claiming a technology or other things. And I think what it comes down to is there are ample support for either view. If they had consulted me, I would have said certify it, but I wasn't consulted, nor maybe should I be. But so I'd say that's what it comes down to. There's ample support as treating pork as different, and saying that this is so close to pork as opposed to those other things that it really raises that historical question. So does that answer that? I'm happy to talk more about. I just felt that I wanted a little more distance to it before I wrote up something on it, and I wanted to think about it a bit more. But what I'm seeing is there are reasons that I could show why their argument makes sense over a 2,000-year trajectory, and there are reasons I could show over that same trajectory why it makes no sense.
Sure. Okay. Thank you for this answer. We have another question about Passover. Old cookbooks list peanut oil as an ingredient in recipes. However, peanuts are not kosher for Passover. Please explain.
Okay, so peanuts are not. This is another. I often say to students, kosher has changed more over the past 30 years than it has over the past 3,000. And this is another example of something that has changed literally in my lifetime. There's I have it here, so I'm using it to prop up my iPad that has my talk on it, but I'll pull it out. I co-edited a book recently. I'll just plug myself. Feasting and Fasting, The History and Ethics of Jewish Food. And there's an article in this by a scholar who talks about, I'll even give you the official title of the article, that talks about the story of this. Zev Elef is his name, and it's The Search for Religious Authenticity and the Case of Passover Peanut Oil. And he talks about how it really is, it's part of a modern story of moving more towards a stringent viewpoint that reflects certain Hungarian in particular practices that then become dominant. So Rav Moshe Feinstein, for example, who I mentioned, had no problem with peanut oil in the 70s. There are advertisements in kosher magazines talking about peanut oil. So I can't do justice to, I think Zev's argument there is really clearly laid out, and so I would recommend checking out that argument. But basically, he shows how it's part of a broader trend. The same thing happens, for example, with certain slaughter that were very minority opinions taking on, right? The idea of glatt kosher becoming a minority opinion that then becomes sort of an industry standard. Same thing with peanut oil, and there's basically a way that certain market forces in the kosher industry led to certain things being considered kosher or not. And peanut oil was one of them that in the 70s, not a problem. And then it starts changing. And so in my lifetime, I was born in 79, that transition occurred. And today, it is very broadly considered not. But when I was born, it was very broadly considered.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Another question, which I will also send you to your private chat because it's longer, but I will read out loud as well. The milk and meat issue, was there also controversy over disagreement over the word cook? The rabbis prohibit any intermixing of dairy and meat, leading to such things as separate dishes. Was there opposition to this greatly expensive reading of the word cook? Or is there some other passage in the Torah that suggests more than cook?
Okay, so this is one of these. So I've written extensively about this, but you don't need to be one of the three people that have read what I've written about because I'm here and I'll just summarize what I wrote about. So the problem that the rabbis have is it says the same words. Right, in the Hebrew Bible. 3 times, do not cook heathen and mother's milk. That's it. The rabbis then go and try and expand and figure out what that means. And then, yes, the question of what does cook mean? And this comes up in a variety of ways. Does cook mean just cook it? Like, doesn't say eat it, right? Like, so I can't cook it, but what if my buddy over there cooks it and can I eat it? Well, okay, what if maybe I can't eat it, but can I sell it or trade it? Can I derive benefit from it, right? And also, what about cooking? So to talk about the separation between meat and milk, which comes about in later rabbinic texts too. Well, if I put meat and milk in my mouth together, are they cooking together? And this also gets into questions about cold contact. Are they cold or hot? And what is defined as these things? So yes, there's huge discussions of it, but one of the big problems that these discussions have, it's repeated 3 times. In the same word, in slightly different contexts. And there's a rabbinic belief, right, that the Torah is divine, it's inerrant. God doesn't make mistakes. God doesn't repeat God's self unless there's a good reason for doing so. God is not repetitive. God is teaching a lesson. So then they try and unpack what it is. And there are numerous debates about it. So yes, it comes, and some of the questions are, what does cook mean? Because cook doesn't say eat. And this develops over millennia, and it still develops today. And so, for example, one of the things that always surprises my students, right, is milk and meat prohibition. The rabbis say has to do with meat that is potentially kosher. So a cow is potentially kosher. A pig is not. So if you eat a pig and cheese burger, pork and cheeseburger, you violated the rule of eating pork, but you haven't violated the rule of eating meat and milk together. But if you eat a cow meat and cheeseburger together, if the cow meat is not properly slaughtered, according to rabbinic procedure, then you're violating eating not kosher meat and meat and milk together. So someone asked a question about legumes, I see, or kitniot, right? Little things. Yeah.
Yeah. Please answer, and we have another few from the list from before.
Okay. The interesting thing, right? The kitniot is a great example, right? Because you have what is kosher for Sephardic communities is not kosher for Ashkenazi communities. And then there are debates about to what extent this applies if you're a vegetarian or not. But I love that as an example too of how I'm always telling my students, and maybe this is influenced by the fact that I love Talmud so much, I spend my time in it, is that the answer is rarely a simple, straightforward answer. It's often, it depends. And I have to ask some variables. And so are kitniot not kosher? Well, it depends. If you're a Sephardic Jew, 100% kosher. If you're an Ashkenazi Jew, it gets a little more complicated, right? But that's an example of a food item that is not necessarily kosher or not. You have to ask some questions. Okay, so what's the question you want to ask then?
Yeah, sure. So a person called Baldwin Lehman is asking actually two questions. After hearing all these rabbinical controversies, is there any wonder that the majority of Jews no longer keep kosher? And the second, regarding the vinaigrette you mentioned, what was the new vinaigrette ingredient which made it non-kosher?
Okay, so let's, I would say that the second one is a little, it's basically, it was the sourcing of the vinegar ingredient, and vinegar has a problem because it's connected to fermentation and the idea of it's connected to the wine process, and very early on in rabbinic text, concern of wine that isn't carefully regulated, and since vinegar leads to real concerns for kosher laws. If you're interested in that, there's a lot written on it. I would recommend Roger Horowitz recently published this book, Kosher USA, which is the single best, bar none, don't read any others, book on the history of the development of the kosher industry in America. It is phenomenal. I highly recommend it. But I want to actually spend a little time on one, because I want to make it clear that my point was not to show, oh, look, there are these controversies. Is it any wonder people don't? Because I'm not trying to prove or disprove that. I find these debates are often by people who are intimately care about Jewish practice, and they're debating what is the proper practice. That's why, for example, I point out, I think when people talk about the Treyfa banquet, they want to imagine it as Jews who reject Judaism or embrace Judaism. And it's more complicated than that. It's the same model you have when people talk about the Hasmoneans and Hanukkah, and imagine that there's the pure Jews and the Hellenizers. It's so much more complicated than that. So I want to, first of all, I hope that that's not what comes across, because I have a deep commitment and compassion for multiple interpretations, and think that just saying there's people who completely reject or people who don't. What I would also say is that there's no evidence that people keep less kosher today than they did 2,000 years ago. We don't have as much record of what people did before, but there are lots of sources that complain about what people are doing. So I think that we should not presume that people are observing kosher laws less today, right? When people talk about, oh, the people came to America and threw their tefillin off. Well, there are a lot more people who came who didn't have tefillin with them than who threw it off. Or there are a lot more people, by the way, who kept their tefillin with them and kept using it. So it's often I find that people are making an argument that fits with their goal, and I'm trying to not do that. And what I would say for this is there's no, I think that you can look at these debates and find reason to be pessimistic or optimistic. For me, I look at these debates and I see people hotly debating what is the meaning of eating. How does that convey my ethics? And you can disagree, like I'm willing to be very critical of a lot of aspects of the modern kosher industry. But I also think that a lot of the aspects of the modern kosher industry are strongly supportable and make a lot of sense. So I will critique what I see critiquable, but I also think not all, that doesn't mean invalidate everything. For example, when I mentioned the impossible pork, I want to point out there are reasons to support that view and to disagree with it. And both are well supported in a lot of evidence. So does that make, so I want to just make it clear that that's where I would,
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. Okay, another question from Irashab, which actually in a way it's related to what you said. How do you think the growth of artificial meat in a petri dish in the future will be viewed by the rabbis?
So the first thing is, it depends. I think that it depends on different communities for things, right? And there are debates about this, right? So some of it comes down to, okay, so if you're in the petri dish, let's get our hands dirty. Let's jump into that petri dish. How did those cells get there in the first place? And this gets into a complicated halachic discussion, right? Is the first cell in that from a pig? Well, for some, if it is, that invalidates all of it. And others will say, well, that was one cell. It's a Devar Chadash now. It's a totally new thing. And so some will quibble on that. But then even if it's not that, the question is, well, what cell is it? And then this is also where the impossible pork thing comes in, right? It's not cell-grown meat, right? But it's conceived as being so close to pork that it doesn't matter that the ingredients are technically kosher. The product is deemed not kosher. So I would say it depends on who you ask and what you want to accent. And for some, certain aspects will matter more or less, and it fits into larger debates. So I would say is I expect a variety of interpretations and for things to change. The other thing about kashrut is it has changed dramatically over 3,000 years, dramatically over 30 years. It would change dramatically if I were to give this talk in 5 or 10 years. I'm sure I will have new examples where things have dramatically changed. So what I'd say is look for some of those variables, and they will be connected back to early modern, medieval, ancient debates, but looking at ways that new technology and new abilities and new understandings and sensibilities affect that.
Thank you for this answer. We have another question, which is, well, also to you, but I guess also to the rabbis in general. Holly Hart is asking, is it possible for the common person to add their voice to influencing kosher policy to improve upon human slaughter standards and methods?
Yes, that is super complicated now. So this gets back to the Postville scandal. And this is, by the way, where also the OU is having a slight, the argument, let's start with impossible pork. Part of the OU's argument is a cultural standpoint. But OU, when the Postville scandal happened, took a very strong public stance claiming that modern ethical understandings of kashrut should not be taken into account. Now, there are a variety of reasons they took that account. One is, and this I strongly agree, so I think it should be. I'll put that out there. But one thing that they responded to that I strongly understand and agree with is there is, and still to this day and happening very recently as we speak, the long history in Europe, for example, of clearly anti-Semitic laws designed to prohibit kosher slaughter, claiming it's on the basis of humanity to animals. There's a great book about the history of this Robin Judd has published. And if you want to learn how it's possible, just Google Temple Grandin, who has showed ways that kosher slaughter can actually accord with what animal scientists believe is humane slaughter. But it requires some interactions and things, and it's and still in ways that would be deemed halachic by OU. But the OU very strongly said no. And there was a complicated history of some Orthodox Jews who tried to create an ethical standard on top of kosher standard, and that there was some economic factors that squashed that. What I would say is, you can write letters to people, but it's also just will take really caring of things. And if you take a look, there are companies out there. All you have to do is consult Rabbi Google. And what I would suggest to people is Google different kosher meat companies and find the ones that are in line with your values and buy from them. Because for all of this, one thing I'd say is economic factors do affect things. And if those companies are getting more money and able to scale up then their business practices goes back to glatt kosher and peanut oil, right? When economic factors led to those becoming more industry standards, that affected kashrut. Same thing here. If those companies start being able to scale themselves up, that might become industry standard. And there are some companies that practice those things, but don't necessarily publicize them because it gets too tangled in other politics. So if the good thing is if those are your values, you can find companies out there that occur with those. And then if those aren't your values, you don't there are a variety of values. There's companies that support all sorts of values. So I'm always telling my students, I'm not trying to tell you what is the right way you should eat. But what I am telling you is the way you eat communicates values. So take some time to think about it and eat and shop in accordance with your values, whatever they are.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Actually, these are, we answer almost all the questions. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, Jordan, first of all, for your really wonderful, exciting lecture. And now I will unmute our panelists so you can say hello. And thanks to Jordan once again. You are unmute, guys, so you can say whatever you think.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting lecture. I also found it very amusing that the whole peanut issue, this living in Israel, having made Aliyah, the whole peanut kitniot issue is a big thing. Soy as well, where especially North America is like, soy, that's kitniot. It's like, well, it really was never considered kitniot until relatively recently. Jordan, you're muted.
Yeah, somehow I got muted. Lots of things fit into that. I'm teaching a Jewish law, business, and ethics class right now at UW, and we're going to be learning about Jews and coffee from a book, Jews Welcome Coffee. That's a really interesting book, and they talk about chutzukah, right, like the little sugar cubes, and was flour in it or not, and how that might affect Passover. And so a lot of these issues come up time and time again in whatever the most relevant food issue is in each day and age.
Yeah, similar to some people. My grandmother-in-law had said that you can't use vinegar because it sounds like chametz, I don't know. And also in Canada, there is on the Diet Coke bottle, on one side, there is the COR hashgacha, which says that it is not kosher for Passover. And then on the other side of the label, there's the Montreal Sephardic hashgacha, which says that it is kosher kitniot.
Now I need to get myself one of those labels. I love that because that's exactly one of the things I often teach. I really try and hammer home to my students is they'll say, someone is more observant or less, and I'm always like, no, I want to argue so and so has a different interpretation of kosher laws,
right?
Because it's much more of a spectrum than people acknowledge, and that's from the historical perspective. That's been the evidence goes back thousands of years.
Right, and it's particularly interesting considering it's diet soda, so it's like the derivative from within whatever is the artificial sweetener, which according to let's say my rabbi, who is Ashkenazi, says derivatives of kitniot are not an issue. So like canola oil is something that we've been using on Pesach now, and I've made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on matzah, and it's like, that is tasty.
And so it's all of these debates are exactly what, like the reason I've been enjoying this project is I'm trying to find some of the more interesting moments, not some of the more obvious ones, where this comes up. And these are some of them. I have others that I'm looking into, the ways that kosher controversies play out, because they're often ways of talking about so many other things. And so these are just a few of the case studies. But again, trying to find all the ways that food is used to discuss so many other issues.
Well, if I come across that label, I will make sure to take a picture of it and send it to you.
Perfect. You know, my email is easily Googleable.
Well, I'll make sure to find it.
Is there anyone else who would like to comment on the lecture or ask another question or just to say hello? I guess our audience is a bit shy today, but they do write in the chat room, thank you very much. It was excellent, really wonderful. So thank you again, Jordan. And let's hope to see you again somehow in the future.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Nice to talk to all of you. And if questions come up later, feel free to email me. And thanks for this invitation. And yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you all. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov.